They were already dead. That much was certain. The rope had done its job, the neck broken or slowly strangled, depending on how precise the hangman had been that day. The crowd had seen what they came for. Some muttered prayers, some cheered. Some turned away before the final kick stopped. The condemned had dropped, twitched, gone still. Death had been delivered. And for most, that was where the story ended. But not for all. Some were not given the decency of being hidden, not returned to the ground, not lowered into a grave, nor cloaked in mourning. For some, the law had a second sentence, a colder one that began not at the drop, but after. One meant not for the flesh, but for the memory. It was called gibbeting. If this is the kind of punishment history has buried too quickly, then now is the time to dig. If you believe some forms of justice are better remembered than forgotten, subscribe to the Punishment Chronicle, because some sentences rot in silence unless we return to witness them. Let's begin again. Not at the gallows, but beside the cage. Gibbeting was the punishment of the dead, a spectacle built not to kill a man, but to display him once the killing was done. The body, still dressed in its final contortions, was fitted into a cage made of iron, sometimes molded to the shape of the limbs, sometimes more brutal and loose. The cage was then hoisted high onto a wooden post, tall and unmissable, often placed near roads, at village entrances, over harbors, or beside the very path the condemned had once walked. And then it was left. Left to time, left to weather, left to us. The sentence was over, yes, but not complete. What was this then? Was it justice, extended past death? Was it vengeance disguised as ritual? Or was it theater, carefully positioned horror made permanent? The cage, called a gibbet, was a rough frame of iron, sometimes hastily assembled, sometimes made with chilling precision, a rib cage of metal around a rib cage of bone. The arms and legs were strapped into place or left to dangle grotesquely. In some designs, the body could turn in the wind, swinging slowly like a compass needle with no north, just memory. The body inside was no longer a man. It was no longer someone's son, husband, neighbor. It had become a message, a relic, a thing. And the message was always the same. This is what we do to those who break the rules, even after they're gone. Gibbeting was reserved for crimes considered heinous beyond ordinary comprehension: piracy, highway robbery, particularly brutal murder. But not all such crimes earned the cage. It was selective. The decision to gibbet was as much political as judicial. It had to mean something. It had to be seen. The goal wasn't to kill. It was to preserve the punishment, not in time, but in space, to walk past it every day, to learn by looking, to fear without ever being spoken to. Time inevitably did its work. The flesh loosened, the face darkened. Insects came, birds came, the sun baked, the rain soaked. The wind turned the corpse like a weather vane of guilt. The bones shifted inside the frame, a slow collapse inside a cage meant to resist decay, but not prevent it. And still, it hung. No grave, no closure, just exposure. And all the while, the gibbet did its real work, not on the condemned, but on the people who saw it. This was not a tool of punishment. It was a tool of memory. The law used to hang men to end their lives, but the gibbet hung them again to end their names. It was a slow erasure done in full daylight. In theory, it was a deterrent, but deterrence is a clean word. The gibbet was not clean. It stank. It leaked. It groaned. It cast a shadow that stretched across entire communities, not metaphorically, but literally. Children walked past it on their way to school. Mothers taught their sons not to look up. Farmers learned which fields never fully recovered from the smell. And still, it was left standing. Why? Because the gibbet did something no ordinary punishment could. It turned justice into geography. It made the act of law visible, unignorable, and above all, enduring. Hanging was a moment. Gibbeting was a presence. There were places in England where the gibbet post remained long after the body had crumbled. The iron rusted into the wood. Grass grew away from it. Even when nothing was left but an empty frame, locals still pointed to it. That's where he was. That's where they hung him. That's where the warning still lives. In some cases, it became a point of pride, a mark of how serious the town was about law. In others, it was a quiet shame, a thing spoken about in low voices, if at all. But no one could pretend it wasn't there. That was the point. The dead man was denied burial, but the living were denied forgetting. There's a particular cruelty in punishing someone after death, not because they can suffer, but because they can't. The suffering, then, is displaced, moved onto others, onto family, onto children, onto strangers, onto history. Gibbeting wasn't about the man in the cage, it was about everyone else. It said, "This is what we do to those who betray us." It said, "This is what you'll become if you cross the line." It said, "We will make sure no one remembers you kindly." And in doing so, it remembered for us all, in iron, in wind, in rot. You couldn't reason with it. You couldn't pray it down. You couldn't cover it. You couldn't stop it. You could only look or try not to. There is a kind of violence that leaves no mark. And then there is this. When the body finally gave out, when the ribs fell loose, the jaw dropped, the last of the spine cracked and crumbled, sometimes the cage was taken down. Sometimes it was left. Sometimes another body replaced it. But long after the physical thing had vanished, the gibbet remained. As word, as legend, as stain. Some punishments end in silence, some end in fire. This one ended in air. It faded the way bone fades, slowly, but never entirely. That is gibbeting. A sentence that does not aim to kill, but to be remembered. And we're only just beginning. In the next part, we won't look at the cage as a tool, but as a presence. We'll follow the eyes that saw it every day, the lives that pass beneath it. We'll ask what it does to a place when justice refuses to stay buried. If you want to walk further into the dark corners of punishment, subscribe now, because part 2 isn't about the man who died. It's about the ones who had to live with his body above them. They passed it every morning, on the way to market, on the way to church, on the way to school. They did not ask for it, yet there it stood, high and still and grotesque, the cage, the figure, the relic of judgment. By the time the second week passed, the body had changed. Not much, not all at once, just enough to notice. The skin, which once held tension, loosened. The eyes, if still present, lost whatever expression death had frozen into them. The joints sagged. The jaw dropped. Wind pushed against the rib cage and made the iron creak. The sound became part of the village. People learned not to flinch. Children stopped asking questions. The horror of gibbeting was never in the moment. It was in the permanence, in the way time folded around the punishment and let it settle into the cracks of everyday life. It became, through sheer endurance, part of the landscape, something too heavy to carry, but too present to forget. You did not look, but you knew it was there. If this is the kind of forgotten truth that history buries too deeply, uncover it with us. subscribe to the Punishment Chronicle, because some sights were never meant to be unseen, and so we return. The gibbet was not just a sentence upon a man, it was a sentence upon a community. It demanded witness. It turned everyone into participants in punishment. You did not need to agree. You did not need to speak. You only needed to continue living in its shadow. That was enough. The placement was deliberate. Gibbets were often erected at crossroads, harbors, or beside main roads, places where travel was constant. This was no accident. The state understood something deeply. Horror loses its edge when it is hidden. But when displayed, when allowed to rot under the sun, it becomes myth. It becomes legend. Travelers saw it first, before they ever saw the village. The shape on the pole, the twisted lines of iron, the outline of what once was human. It told them, here, the law rules. Here, crime does not vanish quietly. Here, the body teaches. But what does it teach? For the children, the gibbet taught fear. Long before they understood crime or law or consequence, they knew the shape of a body that hung too long. They knew to lower their voices near it. They knew to avoid the side of the road where the fluids had stained the dirt. They whispered stories at night about how the eyes followed you, even when nothing was left in the sockets. They dared each other to stand beneath it. For the adults, it taught endurance. You learned to make peace with the presence. You learned to eat your bread and drink your ale while something decomposed down the road. You learned to explain it to your children in words that didn't frighten them, even when you were frightened yourself. And for the condemned's family, if they were still in the area, the lesson was sharpest. They were marked by blood, by shame. They walked beneath the body and saw not a warning, but a son, a brother, a mistake that refused to be buried. This was not collateral damage. This was the point. The cruelty of gibbeting did not lie only in what it did to the dead, but in what it demanded of the living. It took from everyone. It asked for silence. It asked for complicity. It asked for memory. And the body, over time, lost even the dignity of form. Birds stripped the flesh. Rains turned the skin to paste. Bones slipped through rusted gaps. In some cases, local residents petitioned to have the gibbet removed, not out of sympathy, but necessity. The stench, the disease, the sheer exhaustion of pretending it was normal. In England, where gibbeting saw wide use from the 17th to early 19th centuries, these cages became part of the historical topography. Maps marked them, poems referenced them, folk tales were born around them, and the places where they stood kept their names long after the cages fell. Gibbet Hill, Gibbet Lane, Gibbet Cross. The memory outlasted the metal. But even in silence, resistance lived. People looked away. They taught their children not to speak of it. Some threw stones at the post when no one watched. Some said prayers. A few, in dark of night, tried to cut it down. Most failed. The law had not just built a punishment, it had built a monument. And like all monuments, it carried meaning whether you wanted it to or not. The longer the body hung, the less human it looked. The more it became symbol. It no longer mattered who the man had been. What mattered was what he had become. An example, a story, a silhouette against the sky. And yet, this was not justice. This was spectacle turned scripture. This was law made permanent through performance. The gibbet did not prevent crime, not in the long term, but it did reshape the emotional geography of those who lived near it. It reminded them, day after day, that power could linger long after life ended. That punishment could be stretched, that shame could be public, permanent, and passed down. This was punishment as architecture, as landscape, as memory. It worked because it made people live beneath it. And so they did. Some joked about it. Humor is a defense. Some turned it into warnings. Some turned it into legend. But most, truly, just endured. Because what else could they do? That is the shadow of the gibbet. They were not executioners, not in the traditional sense. They did not judge. They did not condemn. They did not pronounce the sentence. But they were there. Always, quiet, essential, and final. The blacksmiths, the men who made the cage. They stood at the margins of punishment, never center stage, but without them, the sentence could not continue. When the drop was over and the body swung still, it was these hands that stepped in, not to restore dignity, but to extend judgment, to give shape to a second death, one not delivered by rope, but by iron. They called it a gibbet cage, but it was never just a cage. It was architecture. It was intent. It was a tool designed not to contain life, but to expose death. And it had to be built precisely. The blacksmith had to consider everything: the size of the man, the weight of the bones, the eventual collapse of tissue. He had to know where to place the rings that would hold the limbs, where the frame would bear the most pressure. He had to design it not to protect, but to endure. The body would decay. That was inevitable. But the iron must hold shape long after the man inside had stopped resembling one. The punishment wasn't simply to display a corpse. It was to delay forgetting, to make sure the outline of what had been done stayed visible for as long as nature could allow. Sometimes, the cages were crude, rushed. A few bands of iron twisted into shape, enough to hold the torso upright and keep the arms from falling loose too quickly. Other times, they were intricate, almost grotesquely so, shaped to match the contours of the human body, jointed to allow the limbs to bend in certain ways but not others. Some even included visors or facial plates fixed in grim expressions so that the head wouldn't slump too soon. The work was, in its own terrible way, a form of craftsmanship. The smith did not need to believe in the justice of the punishment. His job was mechanical, to make a thing that lasted. And so he did. But beyond the forge, there were others. The ones who ordered the gibbet in the first place. The magistrates, the sheriffs, the lawmakers who reviewed not only what the man had done, but how he would be remembered. They decided that death was not enough, that his body should stand as symbol, as lesson, as deterrent, that his flesh and bones should serve longer than his breath ever did. They didn't build the cage, but they made it necessary, with a signature, with a ruling, with a single quiet decision: let him be gibbeted. And with those 4 words, the second sentence began. It is easy to forget that gibbeting was not simply cruelty, it was policy, enshrined in law, debated in Parliament, discussed in reports. The Murder Act of 1752, for instance, gave English judges the option to order dissection or gibbeting after execution. It was not automatic, it was chosen. Gibbeting was seen as especially suitable for criminals whose acts had shocked the public conscience: murderers of travelers, robbers of mail coaches, pirates, traitors. Those whose crimes disrupted the public order in a way that demanded something more visible, more lingering, more fearful. But fear was only part of it. There was a kind of ritual to it all. After the hanging, the body would be claimed, often by the sheriff, and transported to the place where the gibbet post had been erected in advance. The community would already know where it stood. Sometimes they had watched it being raised. Children threw stones at it before the cage was hoisted. Dogs barked at the empty post. People wondered if this time, would finally be the last. And then the body arrived. The process of mounting the gibbet was not quick. The cage had to be fitted, the ropes arranged, In many cases, a team of men used pulleys and ladders to raise the structure. There was no ceremony, but always an audience. Some watched out of fascination, some out of disgust, some quietly, out of grief. And once the cage was fixed, the post reinforced, and the body secured, the men stepped back. The crowd thinned, and the real punishment began. Not for the dead, but for the town. Because now, the waiting started. No one knew how long it would take. Some bodies collapsed within weeks. The flesh too soft, the cage too crude. Others lasted months. In dry seasons, the sun mummified the skin, preserving the shape grotesquely. In rain, the body turned to sludge more quickly, dripping through the gaps like something leaking from a broken cask. The birds came. The insects multiplied. Children were warned away. But the shape remained, and with it, the lesson. And when the body finally gave way, when the bones slipped loose, the cage began to rattle empty, the limbs gone or hanging by threads. Sometimes the authorities removed it. Sometimes they didn't. In some towns, the gibbet stood long after its occupant was gone, a hollow shape against the skyline, a reminder that forgetting was not a right, but a privilege. In others, the wood rotted, the iron rusted, and time did what time always does, softened the memory until all that remained was a name: Gibbet Hill, Gallows Lane, Hangman's Corner. But names have gravity, and history does not forget as easily as we do. It is tempting to think of these punishments as medieval, as relics of a crueler time. But England's last gibbeted body was displayed in 1832, less than 2 centuries ago. Within the span of living memories echo. The cage, the post, the public suffering, none of this is as distant as it feels. And even now, the logic of spectacle lives on. We may no longer hang bodies by the road, but we still watch. We still display. We still make examples. The form has changed. The hunger hasn't. That is why remembering matters. Because the gibbet was not just a punishment, it was a philosophy, a belief that justice must be visible, that silence is dangerous, that fear is useful. And while we may no longer build iron cages for the dead, we still build narratives. We still decide who gets buried and who gets displayed, who is allowed to vanish, and who is forced to hang, metaphorically or otherwise, in front of us all. To understand gibbeting is to understand the long shadow of punishment. It is to confront the human cost of law turned spectacle, to see not just the man in the cage, but the hands that built it, the minds that ordered it, the hearts that tolerated it, and the eyes that looked away. Thank you for walking with us this far, through the iron, through the wind, through the silence that followed the drop. If this story moved you, subscribe to the Punishment Chronicle, because justice should be remembered, and silence is not always mercy.